Greetings, everyone. I'm hoping you can hear me. I think folks are filtering in. And my name's Kathy Moore. I am one of the moderators for today's session, and we're going to go ahead and get started. We're just here for an hour, and we've got some great content we want to get to. So I'm going to move through a bit of housekeeping while folks settle in. First thing I wanted to mention is hopefully you're seeing there's a chat box. And we really encourage everybody to introduce yourself, let us know where you're from. We know that folks are joining us from all over the place, and we also understand that especially with COVID, folks are feeling a little isolated these days. So this chat box is one small way that we're trying to build community amongst ourselves. So dialogue with one another, dialogue with us, and hopefully maybe make some connections and you follow up with some folks down the road. So please use the chat box. Also, we did receive a number of your questions and things you wanted to hear from this webinar when you registered, and we'll be trying to address some of those. But certainly as the webinar progresses, if you have questions or thoughts about what you're hearing, use the chat box. And again, we have some of my other moderators, Jill and Debbie, who are keeping an eye on the chat box, and we'll try to respond to some questions there. Wanted to let you know that this webinar is going to be recorded, so keep that in mind, and also just know that it'll be accessible to you later. You'll get a link later on with both the recording as well as the PowerPoint, and so you'll be able to look at those later. You can share them with colleagues. You can always go back to our website, which is down at the very bottom of this particular slide. It's safehousingpartnerships.org, and you can also find access or get access to this webinar, this recording of this, as well as other sessions and lots of other tools and resources there, including information about the intersection of domestic and sexual violence and housing and homelessness, as well as intersections with all kinds of other issues. So take a look at our website. Also, if you go to the website, if you go down to the very bottom corner, you'll see a link to our newsletter. We've been trying to get that out quarterly, and the last one came out in July. So there's a lot of good stuff there. So take a look at that, and make sure you subscribe to future newsletters so you can keep abreast of other trainings and materials and so on that are coming down the pike. So in addition to this being recorded, it is being closed captioned. I think you should be able to see that down at the bottom of the screen. And again, that'll be included with the recording, so folks will be able to read along if necessary down later on after the session. Let's see, I'm going through my list of housekeeping items. I think I got them all. If not, my brilliant colleague Brittany, who also works for the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, has helped put this whole webinar together, and she's doing a lot of the tech work, so she'll let us know if there's anything else we need to cover. I'm going to move quickly along, since we have lots of information here. Just to give you a sense of who we are and what this is, this webinar is being put together and offered by a consortium. It's the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium. And consortium is made up of 5 technical assistance providers. You see us listed down at the bottom of the slide. NASH is the National Alliance for Safe Housing, Collaborative Solutions, as well as the National Network to End Domestic Violence, our organization, the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, as well as the National Sexual Violence Resource Center and the Corporation for Supportive Housing. Together, we make up the consortium of technical assistance providers, and this whole thing is supported by a unique partnership of several federal funders. So the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program, Office on Violence Against Women, Office for Victims of Crime, Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, as well as the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. So that is your consortium that is sponsoring this webinar. Before we launch into the landlord engagement content, we want to set the stage, and this upcoming infographic really leads right into landlord engagement and connects with it very, very deeply. So this is a brief infographic that really talks about, as you can see, the intersections between domestic and sexual violence, racism, and homelessness. So let's take a look at this for a couple minutes.
Homelessness is an issue that far too many people face. People of color, specifically Black people, other persons of color, and Indigenous people, experience homelessness in a dramatically different way than their white counterparts. People who hold multiple identities, such as those who live at the intersections of disability, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and more experience compounded barriers that further homelessness and housing instability. A recent study found that 66% of people experiencing homelessness were Black, while 28% were white. Black individuals are only 13% of the US general population, compared to 74% of those who are white. Rates of homelessness within Native communities are 3 to 8 times higher than that of the general population. In total, 78% of people experiencing homelessness identified as people of color. This overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color experiencing homelessness cannot be explained by poverty or identity alone. Structural racism, historical policies, institutional practices, and cultural narratives that perpetuate racial inequity put people of color at a disadvantage in obtaining safe and affordable housing. Statistically, women of color are much more likely to experience domestic and sexual violence, and survivors often face network impoverishment. Network impoverishment occurs when the addition of a financially distressed household member places an extra strain on family resources. Oftentimes, we tell a survivor experiencing homelessness to go to a relative or friend's house. However, network impoverishment can cause immense burdens on the existing limited finances and available support from that network. Racial disparities arise at every juncture, from the legal system, to housing, to healthcare, to child welfare, to public benefits. Understanding the intersections between domestic and sexual violence, racism, and homelessness, and applying an equity, survivor-centered lens in our work is the only pathway to stability, safe housing, and healing for all survivors. If we want to address racial inequity, we have to acknowledge it, learn about it, and talk about it so we can do more about it together. To learn more, visit safehousingpartnerships.org.
Thanks, Brittany. You know, I think that video just does a beautiful job laying out a number of opportunities for racism and for racial disparities to show up for survivors who are trying to access housing. And obviously, we're going to be talking a lot about landlords. And certainly we know that survivors who are Indigenous and Black and from other communities of color experience racism as they're trying to access safe, affordable housing. And so I think this particular video and the last couple pieces of data here are setting us up nicely to really talk about why it is so important for advocates to really get involved in landlord engagement. So in terms of COVID, you know, again, just point out some really important disparities that we need to be aware of. Black people are dying at a rate much higher, 1.5 times higher than their share of the population. We know that several states are essentially erasing Native Americans from their data sets about COVID by classifying them as other. By contrast, states where they are being tracked, they're finding severely disparate rates of COVID infection as well as death. And then also research suggests that racial residential segregation is a fundamental cause of health disparities. Let me move to there we go. Finally, in terms of this kind of setup data or setup framing, you know, you can see communities of color are disproportionately live in neighborhoods that are further from grocery stores and medical facilities due to historical racial discrimination, redlining policies, as well as practices. Many people of color live in federally assisted housing, including public housing, Section 8 programs, and these are often segregated neighborhoods that have less investments in their communities. And these challenges are exacerbated for people of color living in rural communities, and because, you know, counties are really far away from facilities and different service agencies. So we're especially glad that we're going to be hearing from folks from a rural state, or, well, not a rural state, it's a plain state, and they have some suburban and urban areas as well as some significant rural areas. We're also honored to be joined by another presenter who is going to be speaking about experiences in Baltimore, Maryland. So hopefully you'll get a range of options and information pertaining to landlord engagement. And I'm going to stop with the setup and the framing and welcome a couple of our speakers. I believe Lee is going to be joining us first from the Nebraska Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. So Lee, why don't you take it away?
Thank you. Yes, I'm Lee Heflebower. I'm in the Nebraska Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, and I'm the Domestic Violence and Economic Justice Specialist there. Prior to coming to the coalition, I was the administrator for a variety of state and federally funded housing programs, including transitional housing, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing in both the urban and the rural parts of the state. I'm also currently serving as the vice chair of the Nebraska Commission on Housing and Homelessness. So have had a great deal of partnerships with both landlords and housing providers across the state. I wanted to start by showing you a map of Nebraska. Many of you are probably not familiar with the geography of Nebraska, but we primarily have two urban areas, Lincoln and Omaha, which are on the far east side of the state. Two other entitlement communities, Bellevue, which is right next to Omaha, and then Grand Island, which is in the south central portion of the state, but the majority of it is rural. So when we're looking at our continuum of cares, Lincoln and Omaha each are their own COCs, but the balance of state is primarily the entire rest of the state, 90 counties. It takes about 8 or 9 hours to drive across the state. So what you're seeing here on the map are our domestic violence programs. We have 20 of them. So as you're looking at the size of the geography that those programs have to cover, it's pretty impressive that they're able to manage that many communities in that large of an area and give services to survivors. And trying to help survivors access housing within that large of an area can be really challenging for those programs. We have limited domestic violence specific housing funding within the balance of the state. Some of our domestic violence programs do have flexible or housing specific funds, but we don't have any HUD DV bonus funding at this time. Lincoln does have a DV bonus program, and Omaha also has some housing programs that are specific. But often our survivors are getting housing assistance from other community organizations, such as state or federally funded programs, public housing authorities, community action agencies, and similar. But the amount of housing search support that those organizations can provide really does vary, depending on their resources and, again, the size of the geographic area that they are serving. So sometimes survivors have assistance and sometimes they're trying to find housing units on their own, which can be really challenging. So I want to talk a little bit really about those barriers to housing that our survivors are facing across the state. So that'll be on this next slide. Housing inventory is really a problem in our rural part of our state. I'm going to give you a little bit of our information that's from our most recent state consolidated plan, and those are for the non-entitlement rural areas. And the 4 housing problems that were specifically noted in our con plan were overcrowding, as was noted in the network impoverishment that we just saw in the video that was shown earlier, where we have families that are doubled up, larger households that are in very small housing units that are really just are not appropriate for that size of household. Cost burdens that are greater than 30%. And then substandard housing, and particularly in our common plan, were noted a lack of complete plumbing facilities and lack of complete kitchen facilities. So even just those basics of having a really safe and stable housing unit can be a challenge to find those across rural Nebraska. About a third of renters are cost burdened in our rural states. 18.3% were their housing costs were over 30% of their income, and 14.3% were severely cost burdened, with over half of their income going to housing costs. So for survivors who are already facing financial challenges due to the abuse that they've experienced, whether that's financial abuse, whether that's the financial impacts of relocation, legal, medical bills, it really can be a challenge for them to try to afford any sort of unit that may be available. Our vacancy rates are fairly low across the state, and those that are available are often priced out of the range of what our survivors can afford. There is some workforce housing that's being built in different communities around the state. Some growth is occurring, but often those are newer buildings that have higher rates that are far above the fair market rent. We have aging and substandard stock. As I mentioned before, there's often a lot of repairs that need to be conducted on housing units. Landlords are often hesitant to invest a lot of money into getting those units up to the point where they might pass a habitability standards inspection that's often required for housing assistance. And lead-based paint is a concern because a lot of those units are older. So if you have households with young children, that's not really something that you can reasonably expect. For landlords to mitigate that, they usually won't invest that much. They have other people that are willing to rent those units and will go along with that and don't need to have it past those standards. And we have a problem with a lack of accessible units. And some of this goes along with just the aging and substandard stock. If you have any sort of short or long-term mobility issues, there are really very few options where you have accessible units. Even trying to just find a ground floor walk-in unit can be very challenging. We've really struggled to find units for people who are needing those additional accommodations. And for our survivors, when you're living in a small town, you're trying to escape your abuser, moving across town often doesn't increase your safety. I mean, across town may not be that far, and often in small towns, everybody knows your business, so it can be a hard thing. So trying to relocate, however, has challenges of its own. If you're trying to move to a community that's hundreds of miles away, oftentimes we see that even trying to do any sort of remote housing search, survivors simply can't do that on their own. Many of those private landlords don't have their stock up on the internet, for example, that you can do those sorts of search. So without assistance from an organization that can provide that advocacy and that assistance with housing search, it can be really hard to find a new unit. Transportation is also a big issue, and particularly the price of gas. If you're, again, trying to do round trips to these other communities to look for housing, it can get very expensive very quickly. And then there is the concern about safety and anonymity. When survivors are applying for other housing, they may need to be putting the reference down of the landlord or mortgage company where they were living prior to moving to that other community. If you're in a small town and your new landlord is asking references of your old landlord, that's a concern with trying to keep your new location safe and away from anybody who might be taking advantage of that information. We have had a number of landlord engagement initiatives going on across the state, primarily in the urban areas. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just touch on what a few of those have been. These have primarily been taking place in the Lincoln and Omaha metro areas. Because those are easier to get landlords together, but they've been fairly successful. Both of those COCs have held landlord summits where we invite pretty much every landlord and property owner in the area, invite them to an event. This year, obviously, we're going virtual, and talk with them about the benefits of becoming involved in housing programs and working with people who are receiving assistance from those programs. We allow the different types of programming to present information about their specific model. Landlords often don't understand that there are a lot of variations across the type of housing assistance that you may receive. They may only know of one population or one program and assume that applies across the board. So for them to realize that there's a lot of variations and some of them may really fit within their business model can be very helpful. We also invite landlords who have participated with housing programs to those summits as motivational speakers to really talk heart to heart with those other property managers who may still be on the fence about that and about the reality of it. Both the good and the bad, and I think having landlords themselves discuss that can be really helpful. We've had some landlords who have really encouraged other property managers to step up to the bat and make a difference for the community, while also acknowledging that, you know, there may be challenges, but they also note that there are challenges anytime you rent to somebody. You're always taking a risk. So that's been a big piece. We have landlord awards. We have a Landlord of the Year award, and landlords love that. They put that on their website. They put the awards up in their office. They promote that highly. So we really encourage giving a lot of appreciation back to those landlords as well. And within those COCs, because those communities work fairly closely within all of the housing systems, we're able to do a systems-wide outreach to property owners as a COC as a whole. We're still trying to, at the very beginning of stages of trying to figure out how to do that for the balance of state. However, because that is so broad and there are so many property owners across that many counties, we're really looking at some new initiatives and how that might function. Nebraska Investment Finance Authority is one of our statewide partners who we really appreciate. They'd been starting to do some outreach to public housing authorities and have some presentations at their state conference about housing programs reaching out to landlords. And they've just now beginning to do an educational series of webinars specifically targeting property managers across the state who may be working with housing programs, talking with them about the unique needs of different populations who may be getting assistance. And we really appreciate that they are actually giving us 2 weeks of those webinars, one specifically to talk about domestic violence survivors and one to talk about human trafficking survivors. And to engage landlords with the specific needs of those populations. So we think that's very helpful. All of the housing programs continue to do their own outreach as well. I have to say, having run housing programs, you find a landlord and you sort of tuck that in your pocket and you hold that close and you don't share that a lot because you want to be able to continue to reach to that person. But having housing programs work together to share that information about landlords and engage them with other folks that are looking for assistance, that benefits all of us as a whole. We want to make sure that our housing programs are working together. Sometimes landlords will have a soft spot in their heart for one type of population or another. They may want to work with veterans. They may really have a soft spot for domestic violence survivors. They may want to work with families with children. And so being able to have a variety of approaches to that has been really helpful as well. So today I wanted to be sure that we gave a shout out to one of our statewide partners, the Nebraska Children and Families Foundation, and highlight the work that they've been doing to support domestic violence survivors and sexual violence survivors who are looking for housing supports. Jason Feldhaus is very kind to come on with us today and really talk more about that. But I really wanted to highlight just a few ways that they've helped with specific populations of our survivors. When they developed their playbooks, which was a strategic plan for the statewide, they were really conscious about including the needs of domestic violence survivors and programs within that, and particularly around the issues of housing. Their community response system is statewide, and they've been able to engage survivors who may not be reaching out to necessarily our domestic violence programs, who may not have engaged with them or have been through the programs and now are encountering some additional struggles. So the Nebraska Children's Community Response workers are able to address some of their needs as well. Nebraska did get the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project funding from HUD a couple of years ago, and Nebraska Children has really been a leader in the implementation and the development of that program as well. And we know that transition age youth are particularly vulnerable to victimization and exploitation. So it's so important that they are able to get connected with safe housing as well. And then the Housing Navigator Project is a new initiative that we're just at the very beginning of. So I'm going to pass it over to Jason and let him share more about the great work that they've been doing.
Thanks, Lee. And folks, we could not do as well in our state without the leadership of people like Lee and her Nebraska Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. They are an amazing partner, and the work every day they do is so extremely valuable and necessary. So I truly appreciate that introduction, but it takes a village to get through all of it. So with that being said, my name is Jason Feldhaus. My official title is the Vice President of Youth and Family Sustainability for Nebraska Children and Families Foundation. That's a really kind of fancy way of saying I kind of have a passion for two things. And one is really trying to develop strategies and increase investment around poverty prevention, wealth increase, and financial well-being, along with a real focus on our older youth population for many years. So we have developed what's called the Connected Youth Initiative. It's an evidence-based model that uses several different components to address the needs of youth that are experienced or have experienced our juvenile justice system, foster care, homeless and runaway, sex trafficking, and other at-risk or isolated youth populations. And so with that being said, that kind of has led my work into a lot of housing and affordable housing and our efforts around affordable housing. And today, I think one of the things we wanted to touch on was, again, some of the work that we've been starting to develop around landlord and landlord assistance programs. And I think I'd like to start kind of here with this. The playbook that was mentioned, Nebraska Children develops a lot of local-based prevention systems, and we actually do not provide a lot of direct service or any direct service, but we create and support coalitions or collaborations through funding and best practices, and also provide evaluation to community-based prevention systems. Our goal is to leverage as much investment into prevention as possible. We started out with the Families Preservation Act in 1997, really trying to address child abuse and neglect prevention. And it has just continued to grow as how we look at prevention as a whole. With that being said, when COVID hit around March, when our communities really started feeling the effect and people went into social distancing, we led an effort called the Playbooks, and that was community-based and facilitated conversations as broad as we can make them, and get as many people to the table to see what the needs they were seeing on the ground, and how could we invest the CARES Act dollars or other additional federal funding to address the needs of individuals and communities. And through that CARES Act, or through those playbook conversations, we looked at vulnerable populations. So we tried to look at families. We tried to look at elderly or senior populations. We looked at domestic violence, youth, and youth populations. And then we used the lens that looked at connectivity, food insecurities, housing, and so forth. And so what we'll discuss here today are some of the things that have come out of those housing discussions to address the needs of most vulnerable populations in our community. And one of them, I think the next slide, is a landlord support program that we're developing. And we've really tried to look at how we develop landlord support systems from the perspective of maintaining and keeping affordable housing available in the communities that they currently are in. And so one of our biggest concerns moving forward, and what came out of the playbook discussion, was that the expectation was many of our landlords were going to provide eviction notices to our individuals once the moratorium lifted, in two purposes. One was to collect on rental assistance in the rears, but our state was in well position, like most states, to access CARES Act dollars to pay for those rental assistance in the rears. But it was also an investment or reinvestment back into their savings through lost revenue for homeowners insurance, ongoing mortgage payments, loss upkeep, or increased livable standards. And what we had heard, as in many cases, and especially in talking with some landlords, was that regardless, the eviction would happen in which they could raise their rental rates to recoup some of those lost revenues. And so it would move those units out of affordability. So we really started to look at what is a way to address both the affordable housing, make sure that individuals have what they need as tenants to be supported and to thrive, as well as what do we think landlords could benefit from. And so we developed a landlord assistance fund. But the one of the twists we kind of did with this, and some of the questions we got from you guys on registration, I'm going to try to touch on this, is that many of the questions asked about landlords that wouldn't already accept vouchers or were not in the need to accept vouchers because they could fill their units outside of that. And so when we started discussing how do we target some of the landlords from a productive perspective and really try to build better relationships with them, we looked at not only how do we provide the rental assistance, but what are other offers that we think the landlords could take advantage of to keep them engaged in that affordable range, and allow the community to develop that relationship with them to maintain them as supportive landlords. And so what we have done with this landlord assistance funds, and we're going to utilize some of the CARES Act dollars for, is we're going to provide not only rental assistance to landlords, but we've worked out a process in which we believe we can go in and do rehab on some of the units, in which they can prove that due to COVID, loss of revenue has stopped them from changing an HVAC unit or electrical or plumbing, or some other increased in livability for the homes. It will not be cosmetic, it can't be carpet and paint, but it would be something of a nature that would encourage them to continue to increase the livability of their homes, while also maintaining that rental unit in an affordable range. With that, once we've got that entry into that, we're hoping that we can talk with them about rental support services and services and resources available to their tenants in order to keep them engaged and the individuals staying in those rental units. And our biggest key to this was that we're not developing this relationship with the human services. The human services will develop a relationship with our economic development district boards, but those local economic districts are who will provide this assistance and support to the landlords. And that was the other key to those that at this point in time won't approach voucher programs. We're hoping that an entry through a different approach using economic development and showing the importance of the landlords in the community as an economic impact provides us with a stage or an opportunity to have those conversations in depth about how we can support their tenants long-term, but also support their need to be vital resources in our communities and maintain their rental units in an affordable housing range for low and moderate income families. And so that's our goal with this program over the next 6 months, up to January 1st with the CARES Act dollars, is to invest in landlords directly for both financial assistance up to $2,500 and up to $7,500 for kind of a rehabilitation project within their rental units. And hoping that through an economic development board provides the space for both human services and economic development to recognize the needs of those landlords, as well as support and recognize the needs of their tenants. And so that's our one pilot program that we're really focused on and going to see where it goes. We're lucky enough in the state of Nebraska to have philanthropic community that's fairly generous. And so long-term, the goal is to see, like Lee brought up, how NYFA, our finance authority, as well as our economic development department, works with private funding to mix and braid those dollars to keep this process going, to keep engaging new and different landlords, expand on landlord monopolies in some of our rural communities through this engagement and investment in their properties as an economic impact for the entire community. And so that's the framework in which we're coming from with this pilot, and we're hoping to see great results. The other effort that we're looking for is more of a long-term effort, is that we've identified some private funding source where we will expand the workforce in partnership with our finance authority and the Department of Economic Development to find individuals that can be landlord liaisons. This is not a new practice. Many states have landlord liaisons. But our goal with this is to do two things. One is to help cultivate and continue this relationship with landlords, and see if we can, be preventative in the idea of making sure landlords have what they need from a perspective of access to nonprofit services and supports and resources in a timely fashion to maintain housing for our low and moderate income families. But it's also a need, many of our communities have said, is that it's the language and the dialogue between municipalities or our government-based leadership within communities and economic-based leadership in communities, and the ability to translate the needs for ongoing affordable housing, workforce development housing, and essential housing, and all three levels of it. And so these positions will also be put in a place where we're hoping they can gather regional data, work and build relationships not only with landlords, but with local municipalities, to look at their long-term housing strategies and their housing plans, and understand how that directly relates back to the population in which is in need of that housing, and what other supports and services are there to make that housing and that investment by those municipalities much more successful and leading to a thriving community. So our goal over the next year is also to continue to develop those positions. We're looking at probably 6 or 7 of them statewide. As you can see, we have, I think it's 77,000 square miles in our state. And so these individuals will have to cover considerable ground, but they will be directly plugged into our continuum of cares, our homeless systems, our community action partnerships, who do already have great models to work with landlords and support landlords and their programs. But we're hoping to be able to expand that bank of landlords that are interested, as well as find how municipalities can start investing in affordable and low-income housing from the perspective of maintaining rental units where they're at now, or what is the expansion of those rental units that we need in line with what of the population of most in need and vulnerable. So those are a couple different programs that Nebraska Children is looking to invest private dollars, as well as some of these CARES Act and public dollars that we've been able to identify. We work with the governor's office, as well as the Department of Health and Human Service, NIFA, and DED, to kind of culminate approach in Nebraska where housing is part of our welfare system, our child welfare system. In other words, that housing is an indicator of thriving for the Department of Health and Human Services. So that partnership is starting to really be developed, and the investment in both our landlords from a perspective of them as being a vital resource to our communities, and an investment into our tenants as being an investment in thriving, is what our whole ultimate goal is. It's the combined effort to make sure that they're supported in communities, so we can maintain the stock that we have, and if not, increase that stock of low and moderate income properties.
Great. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Lee, for giving us that perspective from Nebraska. And now we're going to shift gears and hear from Daniela in Maryland. She's going to talk more about what they're doing on a local level, and has a lot of great strategies about how they've cultivated a pool of landlords, and really the importance of looking and doing this work with the racial equity focus in mind. So Daniela, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Daniela. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the residential director at HopeWorks of Howard County and oversee our emergency shelter to extended stay shelters and our rapid rehousing programs. I'll be focusing on rapid rehousing landlord engagement. So HopeWorks is the comprehensive service agency in Howard County, Maryland, that provides direct services to survivors of intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking. We participate in our county's continuum of care and sit on committees for prioritization, coordinated entry, and HMIS. We began implementing rapid rehousing about 4 years ago. At the time, we only had one case manager, and she provided case management for all of our programs and was the primary point of contact for anything related to rapid rehousing. The rest of our residential staff in our agency had limited awareness of rapid rehousing, the eligibility criteria, and what it could be used for. We learned that in order to fully implement this program, our staff needed to understand rapid rehousing, what it could do, and what its limitations were. Our case manager at the time created a handout for our clients that provided an overview of rapid rehousing and what to expect. We learned that we needed internal staff capacity to begin successfully using rapid rehousing funds. We managed to obtain funding for a second case manager, and case management loads were able to be split. We began talking about rapid rehousing and connecting it to the various intersecting systems at play, specifically the homeless system in our county, more openly during our team meetings. We had a leadership change that occurred in our department, and that leadership went through the Rapid Rehousing Learning Collaborative through the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Through the Learning Collaborative, we had the opportunity to engage with other organizations who were also implementing rapid rehousing. We needed to acknowledge, however, that the population we work with has experienced complex trauma and that the intersection of homelessness and gender-based violence is complex. Many of the individuals and families we work with are experiencing homelessness because of the violence that they have endured. Whether because they left or entered our shelter, were evicted due to the abusive partner, or the abusive partner was removed from the home, but the survivor was not able to maintain the housing. Acknowledging this intersection helped us connect homelessness and the rapid rehousing program directly to the individuals and families we serve. Part of our work as service providers is to have transparent conversations with our clients. We have worked to explain the systems to clients in order to build a deeper understanding that ultimately we are all operating within the boundaries of a system we do not control. These systems can often be oppressive and impact our clients in ways we don't understand unless we have their lived experiences. From these conversations, we've moved on to create more comprehensive documentation targeted towards the landlords we engage with. It was important for us to create targeted documentation towards landlords. We created an FAQ form that emphasized that rapid rehousing is a federally supported program, that our clients will continue receiving case management throughout their participation in rapid rehousing, and that rental assistance is specific and tailored to each client. We have invested the time to educate and explain what our agency does, the specific barriers our clients face in obtaining housing, and our role in supporting our clients. We are transparent in the information we're communicating while remaining solutions oriented. This means that while our clients face barriers such as poor credit, we name the reasons they may have poor credit are often a result of the violence they've endured, and the various resources that are in place to assist our clients in working to address the barriers they have. We make sure to be as responsive as possible given confidentiality restrictions. We often have our clients on calls with us, and we make sure to have releases of information allowing us to communicate with the landlord. We thank them for the opportunity to work with us and let them know that we wish to work with them in the future. These practices are what have worked best for us in engaging and retaining landlords. But we've also lost landlords, and we've lost them due to the way that clients have kept the property during their stay or once they have left. Our options to support in these situations are limited. We thank them for their willingness to work with us, our clients, and apologize for their experience. In response to this, though, we have tried to engage clients in more direct conversations about maintaining their household and connecting them to programs that build skills around household maintenance. Specifically, one of our partners has a tenant success program that we refer our clients to when it's available. We've also been quicker to address any patterns or behaviors we notice while they are in emergency shelter and offer support around that in the most trauma-informed way possible. It's important to acknowledge that cleaning and maintaining a household is a skill, and not everyone is taught this skill. Cleaning can also be a trigger for some clients depending on the violence that they've endured. It's important to acknowledge and see how we can be best supportive to our clients and to our landlords. In order to continue growing with landlord engagement, we've identified the need for more staff. At this point in time, we have 2 case managers who provide case management for all of our programs. It would be helpful to have an individual that would specifically focus on landlord engagement and retainment. In theory, this person would go out into the community and provide the necessary education to landlords around rapid rehousing. Just as important though, they would also be able to provide education surrounding our clients and the barriers they face and our organization in order to build those much needed connections. This ties into the sustainability of our staff in our department. Rapid rehousing is administered out of our residential department. Our department is made up of staff who are primarily Black, Brown, and persons of color. Our advocates and case managers do immense amounts of work. They are often working in isolation and apart from the main office of our agency. They are essential workers and have maintained our residential program operational throughout this pandemic. They've been able to maintain our program operational to provide emergency shelter to individuals and families who are fleeing violent situations. They're working in trauma and experiencing their own trauma, particularly around the continued racial injustices against Black individuals. They're existing in a pandemic and continuing to work with individuals and families who are also traumatized while trying to remain trauma-informed themselves. I'm naming this because as service providers, particularly service providers who provide residential services, there are little to no systems in place to support. When speaking about the work we do, the work we try to do, and the work that's still left to do, it's important to name that we also need to care for our frontline workers, essential staff, and each other. Thank you everyone for your time, and I hope you each continue taking care as best as you're able.
Thank you, Daniela. We really appreciate your perspective and sharing and just reminding us about how we need to focus on our clients and be sure that we're trauma informed, and really just reaching out to so many different people that are marginalized right now. So thank you so much for sharing with us. And thank you, Lee and Jason as well. We are going to now move into some questions and some discussion. So I'm going to see if I can provide a few questions for us. I don't know that we'll get to all of them. I do want to just mention that everyone had a lot of great questions, and we'll do our best to try to field a few of them in our time left. So let's see if we can, maybe one of our panelists could talk a little bit about, and I think several of you have touched on this, but engaging landlords and making sure that we're not breaking client confidentiality. That feels like a really important question. Would one of our panelists like to tackle that? Maybe Lee or Daniela.
Speak to it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
This is Daniela. So the confidentiality piece is something that we encounter with every single client that we're trying to house. Some of the practices that we've tried to put in place are to always have the client on the phone calls. If it's more general, so let's say the landlord needs just overall information on the program, then we speak very generally about the program without violating the client's confidentiality. It's also a really good practice to have releases of information and clearly have a conversation with the client as to what they would like to have discussed and what they wouldn't like to be discussed. We make sure to follow up with our clients. So if we do have an independent conversation with a landlord and the client is not on the phone, then we follow up with our client afterwards, giving them like a debriefing of what we spoke about and what was said during the call. That way they feel like they're also involved and we're not saying anything that would jeopardize their housing.
Great, thank you, Daniela. Lee, do you want to say anything to this question as well?
Yeah, I would agree with Daniela. I think it's a fine line that you walk with those property managers, especially when you're searching for housing, if it's identifying that your program, if you're a domestic violence program and you have that funding, it's pretty obvious that that person is a survivor if your agency is the one providing that funding. So that can be a challenge. I think that's another reason why it can be helpful that you have a variety of housing programs working together to recruit landlords. So it's just one more program kind of in the mix, rather than identifying that this is the landlord that the domestic violence program works with, and out of the 12-plex, there's 6 survivors that are in this unit. When you have a wide variety of options, that really benefits the survivors and also helps them be able to locate those units that are more specific to their needs. But I think landlords need to understand, and it's not just domestic violence survivors, but other housing programs that serve people with behavioral health needs or disabling conditions. You have to approach it with the idea that we're providing financial assistance and we are focused on working with this person to be a good tenant, which includes following the lease, paying their rent and utility bills. But as far as case management issues, that's just off the table when it comes to conversations with the landlord. And if you have a good relationship with your landlord, they need to be able to understand that.
Great, thank you. It's just so important to train those landlords and make sure that they understand their responsibilities. So thank you, Lee and Daniela, for that. All right, we have some questions that I'm going to just throw out here. So what do you do with landlords in terms of giving tax advice or 1099s? Had that question come up, looks like a couple of times. So I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on that question. That feels a little bit like a legal question, and maybe Miriam is answering that for us. Miriam, would you be willing to talk about that briefly? Okay, well, I'll just read her response. She is just chiming in on the 1099 tax question, and this was not clear in the past, but it appears the IRS has recently clarified that landlords should be filling out or filing 1099 forms. So that probably means that you should be, if you're providing resources to the landlord, you might be involved in preparing those 1099s. I'm not sure, that's a little bit out of my scope, but thank you, Miriam, for providing that answer for us in the chat. All right, we had another question on what if people do not want to take a third-party check? What would we do about money orders? I don't know if any of the panelists want to weigh in on that, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
This is Jason. We haven't run into a lot of that yet. But again, yeah, we other than cash, we can't do that. So money orders can be worked out, direct payment to any kind of the contractors, those types of things if the landlord doesn't want to receive it themselves. But really it's case by case, and we've been able to move just a lot of our private funds in a position that's a little more flexible than those private dollars. So we match to that to try to get around some of those barriers, Venmo accounts or anything like that, that we couldn't use public dollars for. So it's not a really good answer to that question. I understand your question. It's so case by case at this point in time for us. So maybe other panelists have better response.
And this is Lee. We did have a state senator who recently introduced some legislation that would prohibit landlords from discriminating against tenants based on the source of the rental payment. So a landlord couldn't refuse to rent to somebody who's getting housing assistance primarily that would pay that, because that has been a bit of an issue around the state, that they would choose not to accept those payments from from other agencies. The legislation, it didn't go very far, but it's definitely on the radar screen. So we're hoping that that will move forth in coming sessions.
Great, thanks, Jason, and thanks, Lee. Appreciate your input on that. We did have a question that popped up in the chat around providing information around VAWA to landlords, and I don't know if any of our panelists would like to talk about that, but I believe we do provide some training and education for landlords around VAWA requirements. Would anybody like to talk about that? I know that Carlo, thank you for answering, but if anybody would like to talk about that, we'd love to hear how you're implementing it in the field.
So this is Lee again. So we have had situations where, particularly when VAWA started including the continuum of care funded programs, that landlords who had been working with housing programs did not want to sign that paperwork. And I think there were maybe a few landlords who just stopped being partners. But it really, we really talked to them about the benefits of that. It's much better that they allow the person, the survivor, to break the lease or move on rather than to increase the safety risk. And we talked about, the risk to the property, to neighbors, as well as the benefits to the survivor. But we found it a little baffling because often these landlords that were balking at it were already working with housing authorities and had already been subject to VAWA requirements. But landlords said they just didn't read the paperwork. They just didn't know that they had been doing this all along. So I think after some education that became a little bit clearer, it was just a little startling for them at first. But yeah, I think it's an ongoing conversation. And within some of our continuum of cares, we've had groups that have been meeting and really discussing sort of case by case how to handle any sort of problems that are coming up with cases that relate to VAWA, both with the landlords as well as the housing provider sides as well. And that's been helpful just in educating sort of the broader scope of folks that are engaged in these issues.
Thank you, Lee. Daniela, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Sure. So when we are providing the education around rapid rehousing in our agency and the population that we serve, we do talk about VAWA pretty briefly. We try to use language that is understandable for everyone. So even the documentation that we've created has plain language just to make it accessible and more digestible for folks. And then we let them know to look over everything, and if they have any questions, to not hesitate to reach back out to us.
Great, thank you. We do have a question in the chat box about sharing the outline for the Tenant Success Program. Would our panelists be able to share that?
So I don't have that, but I can try to find one. It's operated through our partner agency, so I can see if they're willing to give it out.
Great. I think that also I just want to encourage everyone to go to the HUD Exchange. There are some tenant success type of programs. I know that in the past HUD has promoted, so just want to invite you all to check those out as well. All right. Do we have any last questions that anybody wants to ask before we conclude our session for today? If you do, if you want to just drop it in the chat, then we'll try to get to that. Okay, so we have somebody asking if we can clarify the question about the 1099. Let me see if I can read that question. So the question was, what do you do about landlords in terms of giving tax advice or 1099s? That's the question that we received. So I won't really interpret that, but if anybody wants to ask a follow-up question, we'll try to have somebody answer that. And we have about 30 seconds left. Okay, so someone was wondering about the landlord agreement. Do you have a sample? I believe that we actually did put a link in the chat to the HUD Exchange. It has some samples. We'll try to make sure that we have those available. So we are recording the session, and we'll make sure that we send out some resources as we send out the audio recording and the chat. So unfortunately, we are running out of time, and I want to thank all the panelists for their time and participation. We do have a lot of great resources through the consortium, and especially want to highlight the safehousingpartnerships.org website for additional resources. And I want to thank everyone for participating and being part of our conversation today. Thanks so much, everyone.